So thank you for the introduction and thank you for sharing your afternoon with me. I was reminded earlier that today is the Ides of March, so let's hope that really doesn't apply to this afternoon's event. I also have an angel in back. My first slide, she noticed a typo. So let's hope you see no more of those either. I have a couple students in the audience and they're probably looking at me like, you gotta be kidding me. But on the first slide she found it, she let me know, so thank you for that. So last night I was preparing for the day's brief and I kind of sequestered myself in the basement and my loyal dog followed me. And he usually stays by my side no matter what. And after about 15 minutes, he kind of hung his head and walked back upstairs. So I hope that's no indication of the rest of the afternoon, but my one data point isn't too good. I just need to give you a little bit of warning. So a couple of disclaimers. These are my thoughts and ideas. They are not reflective necessarily of the Army War College or the Air Force. These are mine and mine alone. And I wasn't quite sure what to talk about today. These topics are all over the map, quite frankly. So I'm kind of a mile wide and an inch deep in my presentation. If you want to go deeper, just let me know during the questions and we'll do that. But with that, let's go ahead and get started. So this is kind of the roadmap I'll go through this afternoon just to kind of give you a sense of how we're going to talk through this. We'll talk about some characteristics. We'll look at some historical cyber events and how they've kind of shaped the geopolitics a little bit, some implications for cyber. By Big Four, I mean Big Four nation states that are kind of critical to our national interests. And then I'll go through some trends and final thoughts. But before I do that, I want to go over a couple of definitions with you so that we can kind of level the playing field. As I've kind of taught at the War College, I've come to really appreciate the fact that my definition of a word is not necessarily your definition of a word, even though we tend to use these terms a lot interchangeably, like everybody has a common understanding. So first, we'll talk about geopolitics. Geopolitics, as its original definition, was all about a geography and how it enables a nation to apply power. So you can think about a nation's access to clean water, who its friends to the north or south are, whether or not it has access to food. All those sorts of things are really the essence of the definition of geopolitics. But it has also become synonymous with international politics. And you'll see me use that term in both senses today, and I think you'll be able to tell from the context how I'm using that. The second definition is cyberspace. Basically, the only thing is, what that is saying is that cyberspace is really about the physical pieces that make up this thing we kind of call the internet. I will tell you though, my colleagues may not agree with that definition. In fact, the DoD definition says it also includes the data as well. I think that is not quite accurate. That's my opinion. But in the context of cyberspace, we're really talking about the physical infrastructure. And then at the bottom there, I put a little bumper sticker as well. There's this kind of motion afoot, I guess you could say, to kind of interlink cyberspace, cyber, and information, and to kind of treat them as one thing. I personally believe cyberspace is separate from information. I think they deserve separate disciplines and separate avenues of discovery and research in order to fully use those two things. But I do think they have a tremendous amount of overlap, and we'll talk about a little bit of that as we go through this afternoon. So if you were able to read Mr. Anders' article, and that is kind of the genesis for the talk this afternoon, his basic premise in that article is that there have been a lot of technology innovations over the years, and that the country that innovated originally was not the country that was ultimately able to reap the most benefit from that technology. And he brings these up. In his example, the Gutenberg printing press I added because I think it has a lot of relevance to cyberspace and information. And ultimately, he's asking this: is cyberspace one of those things that will add to the list of technologies that were created in one country but is leveraged to better advantage by other countries? And that's kind of what we're going to explore a little bit this afternoon. This actually is a picture of the internet from 1969 when it was first invented, with 4 nodes, one node in Utah and 3 in California. So here we are today with billions of connections. Some characteristics of cyberspace I'd like to talk about real quickly here. One is that it changes constantly. Every upgrade to the network, every piece you add to the network fundamentally changes the network. Unlike some of the other things that we deal with that is relatively constant, cyberspace is not like that at all. No stateless maneuver space. We tend to talk about cyberspace as this virtual thing, and we'll talk about that a little bit later as well. But really, when you think about it, every piece of hardware, every cable, every server is physically on someone's property. It is in a sovereign state. So we need to remember that as we're talking about cyberspace and we're talking about the strategic implications and the policy behind it, that we may talk about it in a virtual sense, but it actually has a physical component that matters. Eliminates the tyranny of distance. If we're talking about cyberspace or cyber in terms of warfighting, if you will, our kinetic effects, our weapons are limited by physics. Our ability to move people around the planet is limited by the number of soldiers we can get on some sort of craft, whether it's maritime or air, and move them. Cyberspace practically eliminates that time problem and that distance problem. Espionage attack, what is it? When an event first occurs in someone's network, it is really, really difficult to figure out what is the source of that disruption. We don't know if it's a thief. We don't know if it's a nation state doing something. We don't know if it's somebody in somebody's basement doing something. So it's really hard to attribute those attacks. And the kind of relationship with that also is that it's really hard to respond to those attacks. So the response sometimes takes weeks, months, years by the time we figure out what's going on. Most connected is the most vulnerable. I think that's kind of speaks for itself. Limited advantage. General Nakasone of U.S. Cyber Command uses the example of a joint direct attack munition. It is a type of weapon that goes boom at the end of the day. It can sit on the shelf for 5, 10, 15 years. And it is as effective 15 years from now as it is today. He goes on to say that in cyberspace, weapons or effects, if you will, have at most a 6-month shelf life. So the turnover is tremendous. Attribution is difficult. We've talked about that. And I've also talked a little bit about the virtual versus physical, which has another component as well, and that is the governance piece. There are basically two schools of thought in terms of that. There's one school of thought that says the internet should be open and available to everyone. And there is another school of thought that says if the internet is on my sovereign country, on my soil, I should be able to do whatever I want with it. And those two are kind of at odds at each other. Open liberal democracies tend to think in the first instance that it should be open. Countries such as Iran, Russia, China tend to adopt the second model. So as we're looking at the geopolitics and the strategy on a global scale, those two schools of thoughts are at odds with each other, and it makes a difference. So since we're talking about geopolitics and geography, you can map the internet just as you can any other way. Just like you can map the world based on country or religion or ethnicity or any other number of ways, there are ways to map the internet. Internet exchanges are key nodes where companies, big telecom companies, decide to allow traffic to traverse from their network to another network. You can think of these as big buildings, if you will, and the participants in these exchanges do so willingly. There's no cost. They share the cost for electricity and those things, but it's not a service per se that someone's selling. It's just people coming together. And if you look at the map a little bit, you can kind of map where things are. So there are a lot of exchanges in Europe. Kind of makes sense. There's a lot of countries there, a lot of different businesses that want to share data. You can also see in the US, there are some exchanges as well. But you can also see on the map where there's a lot of space where there is an absence of exchanges, which can kind of tell you that the folks in that area of the world probably have limited to no internet or cyberspace. So that has implications as well. Back to that, the most connected are the most disadvantaged. If there were, for example, to be some sort of conflict here, any cyber effects we have may or may not be effective there simply because there might not be internet there. Likewise, the more dependent our resources become on the interconnectivity in a network, the less we'll be able to use them, perhaps, in an environment like that. So we have to build in options to kind of reinforce that. Another way we can look at the internet is the undersea cables. There are about 378 undersea cables today that carry internet traffic. Approximately 99% of all internet traffic travels one of these undersea cables. They are prone to accidents like everything else, anchor drags, fishnets. There was an earthquake off of Taiwan that kind of removed a lot of internet service for China for a bit of time until they repaired that cable. Off of Alexandria in Egypt in 2003, I believe it was, There were some gentlemen that were caught coming out of the water with big scissors that had just kind of cut a 12,500 mile cable that affected internet connection for 3 continents. Yes. So this is, again, a way of looking at it. And interestingly, Brazil has a project underway right now to install a cable from Brazil to Portugal, publicly stating they're doing that because they don't want their traffic to go through U.S. networks. So some of the implications, again, of geography and space in terms of potential future conflict or issues, if you will. This is a chart of significant cyber issues, as it says. It's important to note that this does not include cyber crime. This is cyber espionage and cyber attack, and I use that word loosely. On the left, in the blue, those are the originating countries for the attacks, and on the right are the victims, if you will, of those attacks. And you can see the top 4 up there: China, Iran, North Korea, and Russia. If you're familiar with their national security strategy, those countries will be familiar to you. If you look at who is the victim of the attacks, you see the United States, and you see, quote, the rest of the world. Also, if you're familiar with their national security strategy, you'll know that the 5th is violent extremist organizations, which includes kind of a bucket of different organizations, so it's kind of hard to pinpoint any act to any one activity, so it probably falls into this rest of the world bucket. You'll notice also up here the United States seems to be originating some attacks as well. Right, I get a couple of looks, right? That could be true, maybe not. But I'll also tell you there are a lot of tools and techniques out there that makes it look like an attack is coming from somewhere else. And we'll talk about one of those specifically. So that also calls into a question whether this Russia line ought to be as big as it is. If I'm China and I want to do something to someone else, perhaps it's better if I look like it came from Russia. So those are considerations as well when we're talking about the geopolitics of some of these events. So with that, I'd like to look at 4 specific attacks and why I think they're important. If you remember the Sony Pictures attack from 2014, remember that? Yeah, so the movie The Interview was about to be released, and it ultimately involved the assassination of the leader of North Korea. Presumably, North Korea did not like that. So they hacked into Sony Pictures, and they stole vast amounts of data. They stole future pictures that had not been released yet. They stole communication between executives and celebrities, some of it kind of salacious and just private, some of it really important. North Korea also threatened to physically attack theaters where this movie was going to be released. Ultimately, Sony Pictures decided not to publicly release the movie. President Obama at the time said that was a mistake. So if we begin to let nation states make decisions about the release of a movie, where do we stop after that? Right? And you can see some of the headlines. Act of war. North Korea says it's all because of President Obama. All kinds of issues going on there. It's also interesting to note that Sony is based in Japan. So we have a nation state, presumably, attacking another nation state private company that is based in yet another country. So when that swirl of politics and diplomacy starts to kind of get a little faster and you're trying to figure out what actions you can take in retaliation, that gets really messy really quick. Ultimately, 4 years later, one person was sanctioned by the Department of Justice. We'll never get our hands on him. He was also involved in several other things, but that just goes to show you how long it takes to build a case in some cases for some of these actors. The other issue I'd like to look at is Georgia in 2008, and you can see Georgia down there in red if your geography is as awful as mine, right down here. This was an interesting case as well for a number of reasons. A lot of historians and experts will tell you that this is the first recorded instance in history of a cyber attack coinciding with an armed attack. We've thought this would happen for a long time, and this is the first time we see it. This is an image that was posted on the president's webpage at the time, associating him with Hitler. Disrupted government service. The primary target of these attacks was government services. But again, it's that first time that we see a deliberate cyber effort coincided with an armed attack. It's interesting to note that there's been no direct linkage between the perpetrators of the attack and the Russian government, if you will. But whoever did the dirty deeds seemed to know the plans of the physical attack. So you can make assumptions there if you like. A lot of us have. The next one I'd like to talk about is the Ukraine. Poor Ukraine. They're down here, if you will. They have been the victim of attacks, presumably from folks in Russia, for a long, long time. The first one was in 2014. It was a denial of service attack. It also coincided with a physical effort by armed forces of Russia. So Russia is now building up this trend in the environment that we're starting to see. It removed services from the government and from some other businesses in the Ukraine for quite some time. Then in 2015, there was another attack, this time on an electrical power company in the Ukraine. It removed power from over 200,000 people for over 6 hours in December of 2017. The average temperature that month was 10 degrees Fahrenheit. So you can imagine for those folks, that was not a pleasant day, if you will. That is the first public and recognized attack on a power grid that was successful in the numbers that we see here. So again, attribute it to Russia, whether it's hackers or other people in Russia, we're not quite sure. But at least from that piece of geography, there seems to be a willingness to move out in cyberspace where we don't see in some other countries. And then finally in 2017, I think is the most interesting. So some hackers in Russia decided to attack a software development company in the Ukraine. One particular piece of software that this company developed was used in about 80 to 90% of the companies in the Ukraine, right? So if you're trying to wipe out a country, it seems kind of logical to go after a piece of software that's used throughout the country. So they launched the attack via some malware. It destroyed computers, removed data. They were not able to get that data back. What they did not anticipate was the cascading consequences of that attack. Countries all around the world use the software that was developed by this Ukrainian company. There is a transportation company, a Danish transportation company, Maersk, if I'm saying that correctly. So all these shipping containers that we see all over the roads around here especially, there are written reports of drivers showing up at ports around the world with lines miles long that could not get into the ports to get to their containers to put them on a truck to deliver to their destination. One really big fluke allowed them to regain all of that data. It took months and months and months to do that. And to drive that home a little bit, it had cascading effects, felt right here in Pennsylvania. Hospitals in Pennsylvania, to include Heritage Valley Health Systems, if any of you are familiar with them, with offices in Beaver and Sewickley, Pennsylvania, and satellite locations all across the state, felt the effects of this attack on the Ukraine. Last one I'd like to talk about is Estonia. Estonia 2007. So if you notice, we progressed forward, and now I'm jumping all the way back to 2007. This was the first denial of service attack on a country that brought them to their knees. It was a huge wake-up call across the world. When this first happened, I was like, Estonia? Never even heard of it. First, where is it? Tucked up there under Finland, right? Kind of close to Russia. Had no idea where it was. Turns out Estonia is the most wired country in Europe. They are on the cutting edge of everything that's happening in the internet, I believe, and I'll give you some examples of that later. And that was also true in 2007. At the time, we thought it was nuclear in its impact, and the world kind of went crazy. In hindsight, we know it wasn't quite that bad, but hindsight gives you that advantage, right? One of the results of this attack is that NATO kind of woke up as well, and they created a cyber center of excellence, and it is located in the capital city of Estonia today. And they, like I said, they are on the cutting edge, and we'll go over that just a little bit. So all of these examples have some geopolitical implications, and I'd like to talk about those a little bit right now. It dilutes geographical advantage. Again, that time-space thing that I talked about earlier. If you think that you're safe because you have a friend to the north and a friend to the south, and you have open waters on your east and west and a maritime capability to defend it, cyberspace kind of says that may not work anymore. Asymmetric advantages, little countries who don't own a lot can do a whole lot of damages to countries who have a lot. So that's the asymmetry that we're talking about. Attribution is difficult. We've talked about that. A lack of control. A lot of nation states will use proxies to carry out their cyber effects. Militias, hacking groups, all these sort of things will act on behalf sometimes of the government. The problem is those groups have agendas of their own. And while they might align for a little bit, eventually they have other things they want to do and they lose control of those. So that's an issue as well. The territorial jurisdiction versus necessity to preserve, that's a mouthful. So because all of this equipment is on someone's physical space, they have the right to say, I want to take this equipment offline for whatever reason. They have the right to do that. The UN says so. However, in order for the internet to work, they have to participate, right? So there's this kind of imbalance, if you will, in terms of how some nation states are seeing their jurisdictional sovereignty, but their willingness or their almost compellence, if you will, to participate in the internet and to reap its advantages. The effects doctrine kind of says, hey, if country A attacks country B, but country C feels it, country C's got a grievance against country A. We kind of saw that. So in theory, perhaps Pennsylvania can knock on Moscow's door and say, hey, give me some money, you might have heard over here. That's not going to play out, but we're not quite sure how this effects doctrine is going to play out as we move forward. And then norms are not quite normal. In traditional warfare and traditional conflict, we have some norms that's developed over time. That is not the case in cyberspace. There is duty to prevent. So if you're on my soil and I know you're going to do something to Great Britain, as the United States, I should probably go after you and stop you. Do I? Maybe, maybe not. Russia seems to turn the other eye. The Russian model seems to be, as long as Russians don't hack Russians, I don't care. An attack has a very legal definition in the law of armed conflict, and legal experts say that the law of armed conflict applies to cyberspace. So an attack typically has to hurt someone, kill someone, or break something. Everything we've talked about so far today has done none of those things. And then where is that red line? At what point will a country say enough is enough? I don't care if it meets the definition, I'm going to do something about it. My guess is that's going to eventually happen. But we just don't know where yet. We don't know where it is for us. We don't know where it is for our adversaries. And basically nobody knows where it is for anybody else. So that's a problem when you're trying to figure out how to operate in this geopolitically sensitive environment. So now I'd like to talk about the big four, if you will, and how I think they use cyberspace and how they see cyberspace. And the first one I'd like to talk about is Russia. Russia is interesting, and I've used some example today of about how they've used cyberspace and some of the things they're doing. The first thing to note is that they're actually willing to use it. And we believe that they're going to use it again, and they're not afraid to use it, and we believe that they continue to use it today. At the bottom, I put a bumper sticker here that kind of differentiate this actor from the other three. The undermining of democracy seems to be a key staple in their philosophy in cyberspace. They use these cyber militias that I talked about to act on their behalf as proxies, so attribution is even more difficult and it doesn't come back to the state. They see the content as threat, and that's kind of closely associated up here with information operations are the focus. In my mind, the word propaganda is closely associated with Russia. So I think they have a long history of using information in ways that gains them advantage, and I believe that that kind of carries over into cyberspace as well. So for them, it's all about the information operation. Cyberspace in and of itself, even though we've seen them use it to effect, it's really about the ability to use information to bend communities to the way they think. They have some laws that they have put in place to kind of help get at that. Military personnel can no longer post pictures on social media about where they're at or what they're doing. The reason why they did that is that some of their troops did do that in the past, and it kind of exposed some of their maneuvers in places that they really weren't supposed to be. If you're a company doing business in Russia, you have to store any data you collect on the citizens of Russia in Russia, physically in Russia. So if you're familiar with cloud computing, right, where there's this distribution of data, usually for many reasons, including speed, including security, including backups, all those sorts of things. If you're in Russia, you have to keep the data in Russia. I believe LinkedIn, if you're familiar with that, is a company that had to pull out of Russia because they were unwilling to store the Russian data in Russia. ISPs, internet service providers, there is now a law that the internet service providers must be able to function in a hostile environment. They have to be able to continue to service that connectivity, which is closely related to that last piece, the internet disconnect. There's this notion of a kill switch that a lot of countries are going after. And the thought is, if I throw the kill switch, it pulls my portion of the internet off of the global internet. It allows me to function within my sovereign territory, but it disconnects me from the rest of the world. Russia has said by April 1st of this year, in just a couple of weeks, they will test their kill switch. My guess is they haven't identified every place in which their internet connects to the rest of the world. My guess is this is a test to figure out where they haven't identified some of those places, but I think eventually they might get there. The next one I'd like to talk about is Iran. Iran sees the internet and cyberspace as a cultural battlefield. The US is the great evil. Iran is the great divine. So they see this internet, social media as a battle space for those ideologies. They use the internet for two primary reasons, but the biggest focus for them is to control and spy on their population. They're very, very, very concerned about other uprisings, such as the Green Movement that you may have read about, other color movements as they've been called. The Arab Spring, social media had a big part in that from reporting. They're very concerned about that. They are also concerned about disconnecting themselves from the global internet. They have developed their own World Wide Web. So when you put www.ahec.org in your browser, that is a universal global system. They're developing their own so that they can survive when they throw their own kill switch. This thing called the Iranian Cyber Army is actually a reference to the groups of hackers and hacktivists that are in Iran. So the kind of what we think happens is the Iranian government feeds them some information. Hey, geez, it'd be nice if. And then they form, they develop a plan, they execute the objective, and then they dissipate, making attribution even that much harder. So now we'll pivot our focus to Asia. North Korea is very interesting. They see cyber warfare, like it says, as an all-purpose weapon. And I'd like to read you a couple things on Korea because I don't want to mess this up. And this is a quote from Kim Jong-un. Cyber warfare, along with nuclear weapons and missiles. So they are grouping cyber warfare, nuclear, and missiles in the same category. I think that should give us all pause. Is an all-purpose sword that guarantees our military's capability to strike relentlessly. The other quote, he goes on to say, if warfare was about bullets and oil until now, warfare in the 21st century is about information. So again, we kind of see that overlap of cyberspace, cyber warfare, and information. And for North Korea, it is the important thing that drives them. On the bumper sticker you see down here, they have been sanctioned 9 ways to Sunday. So money is important to them. They have stolen a lot in terms of actual money, capital, and they also use it for political score settling, and we saw that in the Sony example as well. And then finally, I'd like to talk about China. China, in my opinion, is our biggest threat in terms of what they can do in cyberspace. You can see down at the bottom, the bumper sticker for this particular country is intellectual property and trade secret theft. China, at the bottom bullet there, has 5-year plans. Their 2025 plan kind of says, and I'm paraphrasing here, we don't want to be seen as made in China, the plastic widget or whatever that your child or grandchild may be playing with. We want to be seen as made in China as being a technological innovation, right? So that's the way their plan for 2025. For 2035, their plan is to surpass the United States in terms of economic power. So by 2035, China's stated strategy, boy, I can't even find my words today, is to surpass the United States economically. They were so far behind, experts believe that there's only one way that they could get there, and that's by stealing as much as they can, that intellectual property theft. That's why it's so important to them, to give them at least an opportunity, if you will, to meet those goals. They've been responsible for an OPM breach. They have stolen data about the C-17, Westinghouse Electric, U.S. Steel, the list goes on and on. So they're not just very focused in what it is they're trying to get. They have a wide dragnet, and they're trying to get it all. Keith Alexander said this when he testified before Congress: "This intellectual property theft is the greatest transfer of wealth in history." Billions and billions of dollars worth of information. One quote I'd like to read you here from the leader in China: "Specific geographical boundaries no longer fully characterize the modern battlefield." So when we think about warfare or conflict from the past, we tend to think about it from a very geographical perspective, right? A country with borders and how it interacts and how it executes that warfare. China says those borders don't matter anymore. I have a hard time kind of wrapping my head around that thought a little bit. I'm not sure what it's going to mean in the future, but I think it's going to change things. I'm just not smart enough to see what they are. So then all of these things have some trends, I think, that affect geopolitics overall. I think transnational corporations are going to have a huge impact on geopolitics. If you think of companies like Disney and CNN and Microsoft, some of these companies have more political positioning power than nation states. And it is all about revenue for them. And I think they are going to have issues with the fact that they can't keep their data anywhere but China for the data they have on their Chinese citizens. I think they're going to take issue with the fact that undersea cables may or may not run the way they need it to run for their data to go somewhere from A to B. I believe that our systems are going to get so intertwined that they're going to have a lot more political leverage. I would challenge you next week sometime, wake up and see how long you can go before you touch the internet in some way. My guess is it would be minutes instead of hours. And I believe that's going to give them some leverage. The Estonia effect, I've mentioned Estonia. Estonia is doing some fantastic things that I'd never even thought about until I started researching this. So they have a national database that they use. We would never be able to do that because of our civil liberties, but it works for them and their citizens are happy with it. So you can imagine that database is exceptionally important to them. So they keep a backup of that database in Luxembourg. I'm like, Luxembourg, that's interesting. Why would they do that? Well, a couple of reasons, right? They're kind of snuggled right up with Russia, so they probably have a little bit of concerns there. What's interesting, though, is that data center that houses that database is considered a data embassy. It is treated just like any embassy soil anywhere in the country. It is Estonian soil in Luxembourg holding a database. Think about that for a minute. And that's just not a one-off. They've been asked to advise other countries in Europe on doing the same thing. They also have a program called e-residence. There are about 38,000 residents of Estonia that have never set foot in the country. They have access to the database, they have access to banking, they have access to other services, never stepped foot in the country. You could do it today in probably less than an hour. So think about that. Residents of countries never having been there. What if a large number of people in Mechanicsburg decide they want to become residents of Estonia, and suppose they form a group and they want to do something? What is that going to do to us? It might not do anything. I don't know, because it's never happened before. But I think it's interesting to think about. Huawei. 5G and Huawei, you've probably read about Huawei in the news if you've been tracking this at all. So right now we use 4G technologies on our phone. 5G will not just be a step in advancement, it is promised to be a revolutionary advancement in technology and the way we use our mobile devices. Huawei is based in China. It is the largest telecom in the world. It is number 3 in the number of sales for mobile phones, so it's big. A lot of security concerns with Huawei. The United States has said you will not put 5G equipment in the United States. If you're familiar with the Intel community, they have the Five Eyes community. It's a sharing agreement between the United States, Britain, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia. So there's this intelligence sharing relationship that we have like with no other country on the earth. There's been pressure from the United States for those other four, if you will, to not allow Huawei equipment in their country as well. So far, New Zealand and Australia have come on board and said, yep, we don't want it either. Canada's looking at it, and the UK is wrestling with it. I think it was last week in the news, there's also a report that the United States is pressuring Germany not to allow Huawei 5G equipment in their country either. So you have the largest telecom provider in the world, third largest seller of cell phones in the world, being told by a nation state not to get revenue in certain countries. I got to imagine that's going to be a problem. I don't think China's going to like that very much. So I would expect that's going to create some turmoil. Deep fakes. You get stuff in your inbox all the time, a picture of this congressman saying that or that congressman saying this, and whether or not it's true or not, it's kind of interesting. Some of us may believe it, some of us may not. It may be truth, it may not. It's kind of interesting. Imagine if that's a video. Imagine if the video that we produce here today, I can make it look like it is someone else saying whatever it is I want them to say. That's available today. So when that pops into your inbox for your friends that believes everything, imagine when that pops into their inbox. It will be more difficult to figure out truth from fiction in the future. Blockchain technologies. So this is a way of transferring data from one point to the other where every step in transfer depends on the steps before it. So if there's any break, you can see it happen. And you see this mostly in cryptocurrencies. Bitcoin, if you've heard that term before. Cryptocurrencies in particular, I think, are going to be a problem. They're not regulated. There are a lot of cryptocurrency exchanges now in the world that are popping up, and you can look them up, and you can buy cryptocurrency, and you can exchange cryptocurrency. In some cases, businesses are allowing payment in cryptocurrency. Again, it's not regulated. There's good and bad in that. That allows a lot of these hacker organizations to buy goods and services in a way that can't be tracked. Probably not a good thing. In China, however, where exchange of funds is tracked heavily by the government, it allows folks in China to maneuver in some sort of spending space that can't be tracked by their government. That might be good. Maybe not, I'm not sure. Right, so it could go either way. What's important to note is that in 2014, the yen exceeded the dollar in the amount of trade in cryptocurrency. So think about that for just a minute, and then I'll read you this quote. This is from a currency expert, Joyce Yang. I think out of all currencies out there, crypto and non-crypto, Bitcoin, one of the cryptocurrencies, is the biggest threat to the global power and influence of the US dollar. Bitcoin's had some problems lately. Something to think about. The rise of information. I think the way in which we use information is more important today than ever. If you read the article, Mr. Andreas says that 80% of the United States' wealth prior to the rise of cyberspace was in physical assets provided by companies. Today, he says 80% of the wealth in the United States is all about information. If you use your computer very much and you order something from Amazon, probably the next time you're on Facebook, you're going to have an ad that's telling you exactly, providing you another opportunity to buy a similar product. That information has value. The way we use that information, the way we store that information, the way we have to protect that information, I think is going to be a fundamental change, and we're already seeing that. And then finally, machine learning and artificial intelligence. So down on the bottom here, I'm sorry, it's kind of hard to see, but this is artificial intelligence back in the 1950s and 1955. There's a thing called the Turing Test that Alan Turing developed to try to figure out if if an individual could tell if the responses they are receiving is from a human or from a computer. A computer, I don't know if I have it on here, passed the Turing Test sometime I think around 2010. So if you were a computer, if you would allow me, and you're an individual, and I'm sitting here and I can't see you, and I'm communicating with you with words, with text, can I tell which of you is a computer and which is a human? They developed a computer in 2010 that passed the test. So then if you look at artificial intelligence development, and this is kind of, you see a big space here where there's nothing, funding was cut, there was very little investment in artificial intelligence, and then you see it start to pick up again. When we talk about artificial intelligence and the development of artificial intelligence, we tend to think in terms of game theory, because we're all kind of familiar with games, and there's a lot of challenges in games. So this right here in 1993 is first research on the game Go. Go is an ancient Chinese game. It's harder than chess. Very, very difficult to play. But then as you see, as it progresses, suddenly in the 2000s, right before the 2000s, Deep Blue beat Kaspersky, I believe it was, if I'm saying that right, in chess, the national champion. Watson beat Ken Jennings and another gentleman in Jeopardy. And then you see this thing called AlphaGo. So this is AlphaGo here, this is AlphaGo 0. And if you'll allow me, I'll go to the other side and show these folks as well. So here you see research, the first research on Go, the game. Here is where Deep Blue beat the chess champion. Here is where Watson beat Jeopardy champion. Here's AlphaGo, AlphaGo 0. So AlphaGo is 2016, AlphaGo 0 is 2017. 1 year difference. Here's the difference between the two. AlphaGo was given the rules of the game, given 3,000 previous games to study, was allowed to play itself some thousands of numbers of times, played the world champion and beat him. In 2017, a new version was built. The machine was given the rules, only allowed to play itself, played the world champion and beat him. So in 1 year's time, just removing previous experience allowed the machine to beat the world champion. And that's in 1 year. That's going to revolutionize how we see things. And to kind of drive that point home, I'd like to read you one more quote. Artificial intelligence is the future, not only for Russia, but for all humankind. Whoever becomes the leader in this sphere will become the leader of the world. That's from Vladimir Putin in 2017. So you can imagine their investment in artificial intelligence is probably pretty high. And then I'd like to leave you with these final thoughts. First is U.S. apathy, and I think the article alluded to this as well. Our folks who are in college today have never known anything other than cyberspace and the internet and the fact that the U.S. is number one. I think that's a problem. I think that's given them a sense of apathy and given them the opportunity to not focus on some things that's important. And I think that's reflective of, well, some of our universities that haven't focused on perhaps geopolitics and the way cyberspace may interact with that and how we may deal with that in the future as we start to think about near-peer competitors again after we stop thinking about it after the Cold War. Cyber against dime. So if you're familiar with the construct of dime, this is kind of the elements of national power. It's just driving home the fact that it's not cyber against cyber. It is cyber against everything. It's cyber against the way you think. It's the cyber the way you move. It's everything. So we can't think in stovepipes about this. We really have to open the aperture of our mind and look at this holistically. Attack trends. The trends seem to be, if there is a political issue that swirls, 6 months to a year later, there's going to be some sort of cyber effect that's related to it. So if you watch that in the news, if you see perhaps the United States talking with, I don't know, the Dutch for some reason, and there's an issue, if it's bad enough, you may see something in the form of an attack that's related to that. Validity versus virality. I believe that whether information is right or wrong is no longer the issue. It's how many views you get and how fast can you send it around the world. Below the level of armed conflict, we've talked about almost everything we've seen except for the 2 Russian cases, and that kind of holds if you look at other cases. It's all below this level that we would call armed conflict. So responses to it, we're just not quite familiar with how to do it. There's only so much you can do diplomatically. There's only so much you can do with other elements of the government. Certainly the military's arms are tied in responses. So I think we need to get creative about the way we think about this stuff. I've talked about how we think and value information. How we generate wealth, that 80% thing I told you about before, I think is an issue, especially when you think about it in terms of cryptocurrencies. I think we need to start thinking about that more and how we're going to deal with it. And then the weaponization of information in social media, both to go after our adversaries and our response to adversaries coming after us. And I think it's worth noting the election from 2016 in terms of this information space. I think if we're trying to figure out whether Russia actually did something or not, I think we're looking at the wrong problem. I think the real problem is that we're even talking about this at all. It is fundamentally shifting whether or not we believe in a foundational democratic principle. And I think we all ought to be concerned about that. So I look forward to any questions you may have. Michael, the floor is yours.